In this video, I'm going to show you how to migrate a Laravel application that is currently running on Laragon on your Windows computer over to the Herd server platform. As part of the process, we'll see how to get a MySQL service up and running, because while you get MySQL for free with Laragon, you don't with Herd. They do offer it as part of their pro service, but I'm going to show you how to get it set up manually so you don't have to pay that additional fee if you don't want to. Now, this video is not a discussion of which is better, Laragon or Herd. They both have their pros and cons. This is simply just for those that have decided you want to switch to Herd. I'm going to show you how to do it. So jumping right in, the first thing I want to draw your attention to is I do have a set of notes that goes through all the steps I'm going to be showing in this video, so you can reference back to that as needed. The other thing I want to show you is the site that I'm going to be migrating. It's just a very basic Laravel application, and I've got it set up with the user's database just to demonstrate our database interactions. And speaking of the database, that's actually where I want to get started. I want to begin by exporting this database from Laragon's MySQL service. That way, I will be able to import that database into the MySQL service I'm going to set up to use with Herd. Now, if you've got migrations and seeds set up for your application, you can actually skip this step, because once we get MySQL set up with Herd, you could just run the migrations and seeds there, and it'll build up your database and its tables for you. All right, so if that applies to you, if you've got migrations and seeds, I'm going to include a time code on the screen you could skip to get over this next part. But assuming you just want to copy your database from Laragon to your new MySQL service we're going to set up, here are the steps to do that. We're going to go into Laragon, click the database button. This is going to bring up a program called HeidiSQL. It's a database manager that comes built in with Laragon. And the first screen we see is the session manager, where we can include the details to connect to a MySQL service. And this should be pre-filled with all the configs you need to connect to Laragon's MySQL service. So the IP address is 127.0.0.1. That's just your local IP address. The default user we're using is the root user. We leave the password blank, and we're going to connect on port 3306. These are all the defaults. If you've made any changes to any of these things, you would want to adjust them at this point. But for most people, we can just go ahead and click open. And if the connection is successful, you should see something like this, where on the left you see a list of databases on the system. There are some default system level databases that everybody will see, but you should also see any databases you've created for applications running with Laragon. In my case, I have this database called MyDemo. If we expand this, we could see the tables within that database. So for example, when we were looking at the application in the browser, we saw the users. So here's the corresponding users table. We can see the structure of the table, what fields it includes, and if we switch over to the data tab, we can see the underlying data behind the scenes. All right, so what we want to do is we want to export this database. So I am going to right-click it and choose Export Database as SQL. And then we're going to configure our export. So for the database and the tables within that database, we want to make sure we check Create for both of those. And then for the data within our tables, we're going to choose the option to Insert. And these settings make sense in the context in which we're working, where we basically are going to have a blank slate. We just want to import the database. We're going to create it, create its tables, and insert the data. If we were, say, replacing an existing database, we might do something different. We might want to drop that existing database first and then create it. We might want to choose like a merge option for our data. But in our situation, it's really simple. We're just going to create, and insert. For max insert size, we can leave that as the default. Output, we want a single SQL file. And then for file name, we're just going to set the destination for this file. So I'll click this little folder icon, and I'm just going to put it in my downloads folder, and I'm going to name the export file after the database itself. So we're going to call it MyDemo, and I'll click Save. And then finally, I'll click Export. And just to check that worked as expected, let me go over to my downloads folder. There's my MyDemo file. Let me go ahead and just open this up in my code editor. And you could just skim through this quickly. You should see a bunch of SQL statements for things like creating the database itself, creating each of your tables, and then down near the bottom, there should be a SQL statement for inserting your data. So for example, here's our statement for inserting data into our users table. All right, so that contains everything we're going to need to set up this database on our new MySQL service, which is actually our next step in this process. So to do that, I'm going to go over to the notes that accompany this video. I want to jump down to step 2. There's a link we can follow here that'll take us to the download page for MySQL. And here you'll see 2 installer options, a smaller file at about 2 megabytes or one closer to 300 megabytes. The difference is what we're downloading here is just a installer that's going to give us access to MySQL, and then you're going to have the option to include some other MySQL related tools as well. When you get the larger installer, it's going to have all of those programs bundled into it, whereas the smaller program is going to be just the installer, and then as you're going through the process and choosing which software you want, it would then download it at that time. Long story short, we just need the smaller installer. You would only need the larger installer if, let's say, you wanted to do some installations when you're not connected to the internet. You want to have everything bundled in. But for our purposes, the smaller installer is going to be fine. So I'm going to click download. They gave you the option to log in or sign up. We don't need to do that. So I'm just going to click no thanks, just start my download. And then I'm going to go to my downloads folder and find that installer and double click it to initiate the process. I'm going to grant it access to make changes to my device. I'll click yes. Granted access again. And then on the first screen, we can choose which software we want to install. I'm going to leave it as server only. If there are some supplemental MySQL tools that you're interested in getting, you could go to custom, and then on the next screen, it'll give you the option to check off which software you want. But for our purposes, we just need the server. So we're going to leave that default option and click next. Then we'll click execute. And you can see here's where it's actually downloading the MySQL server. That's done, so I'll click next. Click execute again to begin the installation process. Click next. Click next again. And now it's going to take me through a series of screens to configure my installation, starting with things like the port number I want MySQL to run on. The default here is 3306. That's the typical port we run MySQL on. But I do have a red exclamation point here telling me that the specified port is already in use. And that makes sense because if I go back to Laragon, I still have MySQL running there. It is running on port 3306. So that's the cause of this conflict. I'm going to go ahead and click stop to shut that down. And then let's go back to this configure screen and let's see if I can get it to recognize that I actually stopped that service. All right, perfect. So I just tabbed out of that field. It seemed to refresh it and sees that port 3306 is now open. So let's proceed and click next. Here's a configuration for the authentication method. There's a bunch of details here you could read through, but I'm just going to leave it as the default recommended option and click next again. And now it wants me to come up with a password for my MySQL root user. For the purposes of this example, I'm just going to use the password demo. And as expected, it is telling me it is a weak password because it is. But in this context, it's just a local development database. It's only going to have development data. I'm the only one that's going to have access to it. So it's not critical. I have a very secure password. If this was a production context with a real-world database and real-world data, I would want a much more secure root password, and I would even want to create different MySQL users that had privileges to the individual databases I was working with. That's a whole other can of worms, though, in terms of production databases. We're just working in the local context here, so we're going to keep things very simple with a basic password and click next. On this screen, we're going to leave the default options. It's going to set up MySQL as a Windows service. We can note the name of the service is going to be MySQL 80. We'll see this in a moment when it's running. I'm going to show you how to look at your services and how to find this service by that name. So like I said, leave everything as the default and click next. Next, it's going to ask about some file permissions. Once again, we're just going to leave it as the default and click next. And then we'll click execute to set all of the configurations that we just made. And we'll click finish. Click next again. Click finish again. And then we're all done, and MySQL should now be running on this computer completely independent from Laragon. As evidence of that, I'm going to go to my Windows search bar and search for a program called Services. And then here's a list of actively running services on this computer, and I want to scroll down and look for that MySQL 80 service. All right, so there it is. You can see that it's running, and we have the options to do things like stop or restart the service. Now, in your day-to-day work, you shouldn't have to come into the services panel and look at the service. It should just be running at all times behind the scenes. Even if you restart your computer, it's set to restart itself. The only time you might want to come in here, let's say you make a configuration change to MySQL and you want those changes to take effect, you might want to come in and restart the service. So moving on, now that we've got this service up and running, let's import the database that we had exported from Laragon's MySQL into this new service. The way I'm going to do that, I'm going to go back to HeidiSQL and connect to this service, and I'm going to get to it from Laragon. I should mention, if, let's say at the end of this process, you want to completely uninstall Laragon, you can download HeidiSQL separately. So you can run that independently. You're not tied to Laragon to have HeidiSQL. But because it's already installed via Laragon, that's just what I'm going to use. All right, so now I'm going to click New to set up a new configuration profile. Let's call this our MySQL service, just to distinguish it from our Laragon MySQL. And once again, I could leave it as the default options with the local IP address of 127.0.0.1. We're going to be connecting as the root MySQL user. I do need to enter the password I created when I set up this service, though. So in my case, that was demo. And as we know, we are running on port 3306. So let's go ahead and click open. And perfect, that connection was successful. So just like we saw when we connected to Laragon's MySQL, we see a list of databases on the system on the left. Right now, though, I'm only seeing system-wide databases because this is a brand new service that we just created. So my next step is to import the database I had exported from Laragon's MySQL into this new service. To do that, I'm going to go to File, and we're going to say Run SQL File. I want to locate the SQL export I created earlier. I'm going to click Open. It's going to ask if it should auto-detect file encoding. I'm going to say yes. And to confirm that was successful, I'm going to right-click in my database list and click Refresh. And perfect, there's my demo database. So here's all my tables. So let's look at the users table. All right, there's the structure, just like we saw earlier. And then if we go over to the data, we can make sure that that was imported as well. So with that, we've done all the groundwork we need to get MySQL set up for this migration process. So let me go ahead and close out of HeidiSQL. I can go ahead and close out of Laragon as well. We're done with that. And now we want to turn our attention to Laravel Herd itself. So if you haven't already, you can download it from herd.laravel.com, and that'll give you an installer. You can run through the installation steps that it gives you. It's pretty self-explanatory. It's just like installing any other program on your computer. This video isn't really about introducing you to Herd. I actually have a separate video on that gives you an overview of the Herd features. I'm going to assume in this video that you've already probably played around with Herd a little bit, and that's why you've decided to migrate from Laragon over to it. So knowing that, I've already got it installed on my computer. I'm just going to locate it and open it. So here we are in the Laravel Herd dashboard. You can see our active services that are running. We've got our Nginx web server. So this is different than Laragon. The default web server used there is Apache, but you should find that running your site on Apache versus Nginx is not that different. And when Laravel sets up your site configs, it's going to have all the Nginx configs in place necessary to run that application. So you really shouldn't have to do anything, but just something to be aware of if you do run in some complications with how the site runs in these different platforms. The other thing to be aware of when it comes to these sort of compatibility issues is the version of PHP that you're working with. So as of this recording, Laravel Herd is setting me up with PHP 8.3, the latest version. And let's bring Laragon back up and see what I was running there. I'm just going to right click and go to PHP. And it looks like the version there I was running was 8.3 as well. So I shouldn't run into any compatibility issues, but let's say I was running an older version of PHP in Laragon and I wanted to make that consistent here in Herd. I could go over to my PHP options and you can see we could very quickly install different versions of PHP. And then once we get our site set up, we'll see a drop down where we could specify which version of PHP that site is running on. So if we were running an older version of PHP for a site in Laragon and we weren't ready to upgrade to the latest PHP, we could very easily switch to an older version as needed. But in my case, I should be good to go with 8.3. So moving on, the next thing I want to do is move over my application itself, the code base, from Laragon to Laravel Herd. And if we go over to the General tab, we could see a list of Herd paths. These are directories on your computer where whenever you put an application in that directory, Herd will automatically detect that application and configure it for you as a new site. So we just need to get our application into one of the paths that are listed here. By default, there is a Herd directory in your home directory where you can put sites. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to move my site over to this directory. Alternatively, if I didn't want to move the site over, let's say for whatever reason I wanted the option to still run it from Laragon, what I could do is just set the Laragon document root as another path that Herd is going to be watching. Just to show what that would look like, I would go to Add Path, I'd find Laragon on my computer. Let's see if I can get it to show me the directory. So this is going to be in our C drive, Laragon. And I'm going to go to www. This is our document root in Laragon. You can see I've got my demo application folder there. So I could just select this, and now Herd is going to be looking for sites in that directory as well. So in that case, I wouldn't have to move anything. But I do want to think about this as a complete migration with this idea that we could uninstall Laragon when we're done. So I am going to go with the move the site folder over to the Herd directory approach. So let me go ahead and just delete this example path. And now to do the move, I'm going to just bring up my file explorer. So on the left, let's go back to that Laragon directory, www. There's my demo application. I've located that. And then I'll open up a new Finder window, move that to the right. And I'm going to go to my Herd directory. And just to show the path for this, it's going to be in your home directory, /Herd. You can see I don't currently have any sites there. So I'm just going to click and drag my demo over. And there you go. You can see that was successfully moved over. Now, just a quick note, if you want to do that copy from command line, if you go back to the notes that accompany this video, this is under step 5, move site contents. I actually have the command that you could use there. So it would be the move command. Here's the path to your Laragon document root. You'd follow that up with the name of the site folder, and then you could just go move that into your Herd directory, where the // is just a shortcut for that home directory. All right, now that we've got the site moved over, coming back to Herd, we're going to go to the Sites tab, and you can see it's refreshing, and it should detect that new site folder, and it should automatically set us up with a local URL for that. So it does it after the name of the folder. So we've got mydemo.test. You can see the path where it located that folder. Here's where, if we wanted to switch our PHP version, if we had different versions of PHP currently installed, we could choose a different version. And we can also quickly enable HTTPS. I'll go ahead and do that. We do have to grant some permissions on our computer for that to take effect. So I'll click yes again, and hopefully the final time we'll click yes. I lied, it wants me to click yes again. All right, finally, we've got it secured. And let's go ahead and open it in the browser. And we are getting an error, but it is a Laravel-based error page, so that's a good sign. We know we're pointing to our Laravel-based application. The error is a SQL error telling us we have an access denied issue for our root user. This is to be expected because we switched our MySQL service, so we need to update our application's database configs to reflect that. So let me go over to my code editor, and I'm going to open up this project. This is now in my Herd directory. And then within my site contents, I want to find my .env, or my environment file, and scroll down to my database related credentials. And the thing I need to change is for the database password. I need to enter the password I created when I set up the MySQL service. Now, previously it was just empty because in Laragon, the root user for MySQL has a empty or blank password. So we just want to update that here. Everything else should be the same. We're still connecting on the DB host of 127.0.0.1. We're still using port 3306. The database name was the same. So we should be good to go. We just have to add that password. So let me save those changes, go back to the browser and refresh. And perfect. Our application is now loading without any errors, and we very clearly have a connection to our database because we're able to extract our user information. So at this point, the switch over from Laragon to Herd is complete. But I do want to rewind a little bit. Earlier, I talked about how you could set up your database on your new MySQL instance using Laravel migrations and seeds if you had them in place for your application. Now, in order to do that, we do need to interact with our application from command line. Specifically, we need to use PHP in command line to invoke Laravel's artisan tool. That's how we can run our migrations and seeds. And one way we can do that, now that we're working with Herd, is if we open up PowerShell. We should have access to instances of PHP that came installed with Herd directly from our PowerShell command line. Just as evidence of this, let's run the php -version command. So you can see we've got PHP 8.3.6. We can also run where.exe PHP, and you can see that's locating it within a bin directory within some internal Herd configuration directories. So seeing we have access to that, I'm going to go into my Herd directory. Here's my demo application I'm working in, so let me change into that. And then using PHP, I can evoke that artisan tool. And just as an example, I will run my migrations in this application. Now in this case, because I did import the database from Laragon, where it had already run migrations. There was no new changes to the database. It is telling me there is nothing to migrate. So let's do a fresh migration. So that dropped all my tables and recreated them using my migration files. And so if I go back to my application, I should now see basically an empty data set because I wiped out all my data when I ran those migrations. But of course, if you have seeds in place, we could rebuild that. So going back to command line, I'll say PHP artisan db seed. And then I should have my data back. Perfect. All right, so basic migration and seeding process at work there. The key thing I'm demonstrating, though, is just that we have access to PHP commands and artisan via the PowerShell terminal. Similarly, for our outside dependencies, Composer, if we want to update our dependencies, we can run Composer update, and we should have access to it. I want to pause this video here for a moment. I'm adding this note as I'm going through and editing the video. As you can see, we did have access to the Composer command, which is good, and it did run, but we are getting a warning about an ambiguous class resolution. And when I first recorded this video, I kind of skimmed over that, but in the editing process, I took a closer look at it, and I found the solution to this particular warning is I just needed to delete my vendor directory in this project, run Composer update again, and that would rebuild that vendor directory for me, and then it ran to completion without any sort of warnings. And I believe the reason that we were seeing the warning to begin with was because we took a project that we had initially run Composer in a completely different directory. And when Composer runs, not only does it download our outside dependencies, it writes things like a class map. It references different paths in our projects. So I think when we took that project and just moved it to an entirely different directory and then tried to run Composer update again, it created some kinks within the system because maybe there was some different path references. So long story short, by just deleting that vendor directory, it allows Composer to have a fresh start to make sure it grabs all of our dependencies and then writes our class map files with paths that are related to the new directory that it exists in. All right, so once again, in summary, when you're doing a migration like this, you're just moving a Laravel project from one directory to another. It's a good idea to delete the vendor directory, run Composer update. It will regenerate that vendor directory for you fresh. All right, so that note aside, let's get back into the regular flow of the video. But let's talk about, let's say PowerShell is not your command line program of choice. If you're coming from Laragon, you might be used to working with Commander because that's the default command line program they have built in. If you click the terminal button from the main screen, it'll open Commander. And if we run the command which PHP here, we can see it's actually pointing to a version of PHP within the Laragon install, which if we're trying to completely migrate away from Laragon, that is not something we would want to continue to use anymore. So if you're in a situation where you really like working with Commander, you still want to work with it when you're using Herd, and you plan on getting rid of Laragon, I actually am going to put out a separate video on this that's going to talk about how you can independently install Commander and set things up so it will access the PHP and Composer that comes with Herd. I'll also be talking about in that video, if you work with Git Bash, how to make sure that you can access those PHP and Composer executables from within Herd, and just make sure everything is pointing to the right software that you're expecting to be using when you're working with your applications. All right, so long story short, for the quick migration process, just to get up and running with Composer and PHP, just go ahead and use PowerShell, but check out that other video if you want to do a little more customization and be able to use these tools within other command line-based programs. But with that, I'm going to wrap up this video. If anything I showed along the way didn't work as expected on your end, feel free to leave a comment below and I can help you troubleshoot.